Imagine waking up in the morning, walking to the market to buy bread, greeting your neighbors, and going about your day, knowing that by nightfall, half the people you saw might be dead. Imagine a world where touching your own child could be a death sentence, where the smell of death hung so thick in the air you could taste it, and where the most learned minds on earth had no answers, only theories about poisoned air and angry gods. This wasn't a distant apocalypse. This was daily life for millions of people in the 14th century. This was life during the Black Death. And for those who lived through it, every single day was a gamble with extinction itself. Today, using advanced AI technology, we're going to walk the actual streets of medieval cities as they were consumed by the deadliest pandemic in human history. You won't just hear about the plague, you will see it. You will feel what it was like to live in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. We're going to experience the terror, the superstition, the desperate faith, and the unimaginable choices people had to make just to survive one more day. Before the plague arrived, life in medieval Europe had reached a height that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. This wasn't the Dark Ages of popular imagination. By 1340, Europe was thriving in ways that would seem miraculous to their great-grandparents. The population had exploded. Villages that once held 100 souls now held 500. Cities like Paris, Florence, and London had burst through their old Roman walls, creating sprawling suburbs of timber houses packed so tightly together you could jump from rooftop to rooftop. The streets were narrow, winding, chaotic rivers of human activity. From dawn until dusk, they echoed with the sounds of a living, breathing civilization. Blacksmiths hammered iron. Bakers shouted the price of bread. Merchants argued in a dozen languages over the price of wool, spices, and wine. Children ran through the alleys, dodging carts pulled by oxen. The smell was overwhelming. A mix of horse manure, wood smoke, roasting meat, and the ever-present stench of open sewers running down the middle of every street. It was filthy by modern standards, yes, but it was alive, gloriously, chaotically alive. The medieval city was organized into parishes, each with its own church. The church bells were the heartbeat of the community, marking the hours of prayer, announcing births, deaths, and emergencies. Religion wasn't a separate part of life. It was life. Every major event, from planting crops to signing a contract, was done in the sight of God. The Virgin Mary, the saints, and the angels were as real to people as their neighbors. And above the narrow streets, rising like stone prayers toward heaven, were the great Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Canterbury, the Duomo of Florence. These weren't just buildings. They were statements of collective faith and ambition, monuments that said, "We are closer to God than our ancestors ever were." But beneath this vibrant surface, there were cracks. The medieval warm period was ending. Harvests were becoming less reliable. The population had grown so large that in some regions, there simply wasn't enough food. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already shown how fragile this prosperity was. Millions starved. The survivors were weakened, malnourished, and vulnerable. And then, in the autumn of 1347, death arrived by sea. The plague didn't announce itself with trumpets or warnings. It crept into Europe quietly, hiding in the holds of merchant ships. The first wave hit the port cities of the Mediterranean: Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Sailors staggered off ships, delirious with fever, their bodies covered in black, swollen lumps the size of apples. Most were dead within days. At first, the local authorities tried to contain it. They ordered the ships turned away, but it was already too late. The real killers weren't the dying sailors. They were the rats, thousands of them, black and brown, scurrying off the ships and into the docks, the warehouses, the bakeries. And on the backs of those rats were fleas, tiny bloodsuckers carrying a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When the rats began to die, the fleas jumped to the next available warm body. Humans, whereas the bite was almost painless, a tiny pinprick. But within days, the victim would develop a fever. Then came the chills, violent shaking that no amount of blankets could stop. Then the vomiting, black and bilious, and then the buboes appeared, painful, grotesque swellings in the groin, armpits and neck, filled with blood and pus. The lymph nodes were desperately trying to fight the infection, but they were losing. The pain was indescribable. Victims writhed in agony, begging for death. Their skin turned dark with subcutaneous hemorrhaging, giving the disease its terrifying name: the Black Death. In the final stages, many victims developed the pneumonic form, where the bacteria infected the lungs. They coughed up blood, spreading the disease directly through the air. This form killed even faster, sometimes in less than 24 hours. But when the plague hit a city, it moved through the population like wildfire through dry grass. Medieval cities were perfect incubators. Houses were crammed together. Families slept in the same bed. There was no concept of germ theory, no understanding of contagion. People didn't isolate the sick. They crowded around them, praying, caring, saying goodbye. Every act of love became an act of transmission. Let's step into the life of an ordinary person, a baker in Florence, a city that would lose 60% of its population. His name is Marco. He's 34 years old, married, with 3 children. He lives in a modest 2-story house in a narrow street near the Arno River. The ground floor is his bakery. The family lives above, in 2 small rooms. In early 1348, Marco hears rumors of a terrible sickness in the ports, but Florence is inland, protected by its walls and its wealth. The city government assures everyone that the pestilence will not reach them. But by April, the first cases appear. A merchant who had traveled to Pisa comes home with a fever. Within a week, his entire household is dead. Then the house next to his. Then the house next to that. Marco watches from his bakery as the rhythm of the city begins to change. At first, people are cautious but hopeful. They attend extra masses, praying for deliverance. The priests assure them that if they confess their sins and live righteously, God will spare the faithful. But the plague doesn't distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. It kills priests as quickly as thieves. It kills children faster than adults. Marco's youngest daughter, only 5 years old, wakes up one morning with a fever. By that evening, the buboes have appeared under her arms. Marco's wife, Elena, refuses to leave her side. She holds the girl, wipes her forehead, whispers prayers. Marco begs her to stay away. But how can a mother abandon her child? Within 3 days, his daughter is dead. Within a week, his wife is showing symptoms. Marco is faced with an impossible choice: stay and care for his wife, on risking his own life and the lives of his 2 remaining children, or flee and save whoever he can. He chooses to stay. His wife dies in agony, calling out for her daughter. Marco buries her in the backyard because the cemeteries are overflowing. There's no priest available to perform the last rites. He wraps her body in a sheet, digs a shallow grave, and says a prayer he half remembers from childhood. His 2 surviving children, both boys, help him pile stones on top to keep the dogs away. A week later, the oldest boy develops a fever. Marco doesn't even try to fight it anymore. He holds his son, and when the boy dies, he wraps him in the same sheet he used for his wife and buries him next to her. The youngest son miraculously doesn't get sick. Marco decides to flee. He closes the bakery, packs what little food he has, and they leave Florence on foot, joining a river of refugees heading for the countryside. But the countryside offers no sanctuary. The plague is everywhere. The roads of Europe in 1348 became highways of desperation. Entire families fled the cities, carrying whatever they could: blankets, food, a few coins. They were searching for clean air, for anywhere the pestilence hadn't reached. But they carried the infection with them. When refugees arrived at a village, the locals would sometimes try to drive them away with pitchforks and stones, screaming at them to leave. But compassion often won over fear, and the refugees were allowed in. Within weeks, the village would be infected. The roads were lined with the dead. Bodies were left where they fell, rotting in the sun because there was no one to bury them. Travelers would pass by without stopping, covering their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar, believing it would protect them from the corrupted air. The social order began to collapse, where farmers abandoned their fields mid-harvest. Why work for a future that might not come? Entire villages were deserted, the houses standing empty, the doors left open. Animals, cows, pigs, chickens, wandered free, and many starved or turned feral. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of human presence, began to venture closer to the towns. The economic system ground to a halt. Trade stopped. Markets closed. Money became meaningless when there was nothing to buy and no one to buy from. The legal system collapsed because there were no judges, no clerks, no one to enforce the law. Crime, paradoxically, didn't explode as you might expect. Most people were too terrified and exhausted to steal. But in some places, gangs of survivors roamed the countryside, looting abandoned houses and killing anyone who resisted. And the most heartbreaking aspect of the plague was the way it shattered the most basic human bonds. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, described scenes that still shock us today. He wrote of fathers abandoning sick sons, of servants fleeing their masters, of the sick being locked inside their homes by their own families, left to die alone. The fear of contagion was so overwhelming that it overrode every instinct of compassion. Boccaccio described one case where a wealthy man, dying of the plague, called out for help from his window. His neighbors, afraid to enter, threw food through the window but refused to come near. The man died alone, and his body remained in the house for days until the smell became unbearable. Even the dead were treated without dignity. In the beginning, its people tried to maintain the rituals, washing the body, dressing it in fine clothes, holding a funeral mass, burying it in consecrated ground. But as the deaths multiplied, these traditions became impossible. Bodies were dumped into mass graves, plague pits, without ceremony. In some cities, the graves were so full that corpses were stacked on top of each other, covered with a thin layer of dirt, and then more corpses were added. The smell of death was inescapable. The church, the central pillar of medieval life, faced its greatest crisis. People flooded into the cathedrals, desperate for divine intervention. They confessed their sins, took communion, donated whatever they had left to the church. The priests worked tirelessly, performing last rites for the dying, comforting the grieving, burying the dead. But then the priests began to die. And when the priests died, people's faith began to crack. How could God allow this? Why were the faithful dying just as quickly as sinners? Why were priests, who lived holy lives, dying by the thousands? The official church position, endorsed by the Pope, was that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. The solution, they said, was repentance, prayer, and faith. But as the death toll mounted and the prayers seemed unanswered, the many people began to search for other explanations and other scapegoats. In the absence of medical knowledge, people turned to superstition and paranoia. One of the most pervasive and horrific responses was the scapegoating of Jewish communities. A conspiracy theory spread across Europe. The Jews were poisoning the wells. It was absurd. Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians, but fear and hatred don't require logic. In cities across the Holy Roman Empire, Jewish neighborhoods were attacked. In Strasbourg, the entire Jewish population, around 2,000 people, was rounded up and burned alive in a wooden structure built specifically for that purpose. In Mainz, Cologne, and dozens of other cities, similar atrocities occurred. The Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning the violence and pointing out that Jews were also dying of the plague, but his words had little effect. The mob needed someone to blame. Another response was the flagellant movement. These were groups of men, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, who marched from town to town, dressed in white robes marked with red crosses. Twice a day they would gather in the town square, stripped to the waist, and whip themselves with leather scourges embedded with iron spikes. They believed that by taking on physical suffering, they could atone for humanity's sins and appease God's wrath. The flagellants were both terrifying and mesmerizing. They sang hymns as they whipped themselves, drawing blood, sometimes beating themselves until they collapsed. The church initially tolerated them, but eventually condemned the movement as heretical because the flagellants claimed they didn't need priests to intercede with God. They could atone directly through their own suffering. By 1350, the movement was suppressed, but it revealed the depth of desperation people felt. Daily life during the plague was a surreal combination of normalcy and apocalypse. For those who survived, life had to go on. Bread still needed to be baked, water still needed to be carried, children still needed to be fed. But everything was tinged with an overwhelming sense of doom. People avoided touching each other. They stopped shaking hands, stopped embracing. Conversations were held at a distance. The Italian physician Gentile da Foligno, before he himself died of the plague, recommended that people avoid foul air by staying indoors, burning aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary, and carrying pouches of herbs. Doctors wore strange costumes, long robes, gloves, and beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, meant to filter the corrupted air. These plague doctors looked like humanoid birds, and their appearance was almost as terrifying as the disease itself. Medical treatments were desperate and useless. Doctors drained blood from patients who were already weak from illness. They lanced the buboes, trying to release the evil humors, which only caused agonizing pain and spread the infection. Some prescribed potions made from crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn, expensive, rare, and completely ineffective. Others recommended sitting between two large fires to dry out the corrupted air. The wealthy, of course, had more options. They fled to the countryside, isolating themselves in rural estates. The poet Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron is set during the plague and tells the story of 10 young nobles who flee Florence and entertain each other with stories while the city dies around them. But even wealth was no guarantee of survival. The plague killed indiscriminately. Kings, bishops, and nobles died just as quickly as beggars. For the poor, there was no escape. They couldn't afford to flee, couldn't afford doctors, couldn't afford anything but to endure. And yet, strangely, there were also moments of unexpected humanity. Some people, knowing they might die at any moment, chose to live fully. They threw parties, drank wine, made love, laughed. Boccaccio described people who decided that if the world was ending, they would enjoy what little time they had left. Others became more devout, spending their days in prayer and charity. Some wealthy individuals used their final days to endow hospitals or feed the poor, hoping to secure a place in heaven. There was no single response to the plague. Every person, every family, every community had to find their own way to survive, or to die. By 1351, the worst of the first wave was over. The plague had burned through Europe, killing an estimated 50% of the population, perhaps 25 million people in 5 years. But the survivors emerged into a world that was fundamentally changed. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos. With half the population gone, there was a severe labor shortage. Fields were left unplanted. Entire villages stood empty. The manorial system, which had depended on a steady supply of peasant labor, began to collapse. For the first time in centuries, ordinary workers had leverage. Lords, desperate to have their lands worked, were forced to offer higher wages and better working conditions. Serfdom, the system that had bound peasants to the land for generations, began to weaken. In England, but the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was directly linked to the upheaval caused by the plague. Workers demanded fair wages and freedom, and while the revolt was crushed, it signaled that the old order was breaking. The psychological impact was just as profound. The plague destroyed the optimism of the High Middle Ages. People had believed that they were building a Christian utopia, that they were closer to God than their ancestors. The plague shattered that belief. It proved that no amount of faith, no amount of wealth could protect you from death. This existential crisis led to a cultural obsession with death. Art became darker. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a popular motif in paintings and manuscripts. It showed skeletons leading popes, kings, and peasants to their graves, a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. Tombs were decorated with images of decaying corpses, a genre called transy. The message was clear: remember you will die. The Black Death also changed the economy in unexpected ways. With fewer people, resources were less scarce. The survivors found themselves relatively wealthier. Wages rose. The price of land fell. For the peasant class, the decades after the plague were, paradoxically, a time of rising living standards, the golden age of the laborer. But the trauma never fully healed. The plague returned in waves: 1361, 1369, 1374, and periodically for the next 3 centuries. Each outbreak reminded people that the world was fragile, that death could come at any moment. Living through the Black Death meant living in a constant state of terror and uncertainty. It meant watching your loved ones die and being powerless to help. It meant making impossible choices: stay and risk death, or flee and abandon everything you knew. It meant questioning everything you believed about God, justice, and the meaning of life. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the medieval worldview. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical, more questioning, more aware of its own mortality. In many ways, the Renaissance, the rebirth of art, science, and humanism, was born from the ashes of the Black Death. People who had seen the world end and survived decided to live differently, to question authority, to seek knowledge, to embrace life with a new intensity. Today, we look back at the Black Death as a historical event, a distant tragedy. But for the people who lived through it, it was an apocalypse that happened in slow motion, day by day, death by death. And the lessons they learned about resilience, about the fragility of civilization, about the importance of science and compassion, are lessons we still carry with us. Because pandemics don't belong to the past. They remind us that we are never as safe as we think, that the bonds of society are more fragile than we believe, that in the face of existential threat, humanity reveals both its darkest cruelty and its most profound courage. The Black Death was a test of civilization, and history has a way of repeating its tests.